Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Week 9 discussion of Brown British Beer, Scottish Ale, and Irish Beer. We're going to jump right into our slides here because that's really far more important than being able to see my face this early morning when I am recording this. So once again, thank you everyone for your understanding in me needing to reschedule this. And just remember, if you have any questions about the styles that we'll talk about today, you are, of course, always able to email me, fill out the submit a question form on the website, or amazingly, in just a few short weeks, we're going to be having our last review session. So you can bring any questions you have about the brown British beer styles, Scottish ale styles, and Irish beer styles to that review session as well. So let's get started. Today, we're going to be discussing 9 styles. We'll be talking about dark mild, British brown ale, English porter, Scottish light, Scottish heavy, Scottish export, and then we'll finish up with Irish red ale, Irish stout, and Irish extra stout. As always, I have the pictures here of the 2 different score sheets that you are most likely to see when you go into either a competition, which would be the competition score sheet on the left, or the exam score sheet for when you're taking your BJCP beer judging exam. I like to include these in each one so you understand that there will be differences between the score sheets that you'll see, particularly when you go into the exam. You won't have those off flavor explanations there. You will have to provide those explanations, whereas when you're in a competition setting, judging beers, you'll have almost all of the information you need right there on your score sheet. So with brown British beer, the BJCP guidelines reflect the modern versions of dark mild, British brown ale, and English porter. And really, when it comes to each one of these styles, particularly dark mild, and as we discussed, the bitter family a few weeks ago, there is a really deep, well-recorded history of each one of those beer styles. And I recommend, if you're interested in learning more about those beers, a really great book to read is Amber, Brown, and Black by Martin Cornell. That is just a very definitive history of a lot of these more historical versions of the styles. But for today, what we'll be focusing on is the modern versions. So these are going to be low to moderate strength, dark colored, generally malt balanced. And the last important note to make is that there's no historic relationship between these 3. We've talked in previous sessions before about the different styles being slotted into different categories, and sometimes those categories move and morph. These 3 are in this category because of that low to moderate strength, the dark color, the generally malt balance, rather than being related to each other. So the dark mild, that is going to be a low gravity, dark, malt-focused British session ale, readily suited to drinking in quantity. And we've talked about the low gravity, readily suited to drinking in quantity with the bitters family. We also talked about it when we were talking about German beers, things like Munich Helles, and these, something like a dark mild is very much a pub culture beer. It's the beer that you can set for hours and drink with friends, and not have and be able to still walk home, right? So the dark mild is going to be lower ABV range, 3.0 to 3.8%. So our malt aroma for dark mild is going to be low to moderate. It can include caramel, toasty, grainy, toffee, nutty, chocolate, or lightly roasted malt flavors. It may have some fruitiness to it. The hops are going to be none to low. If they're there, we would expect the English hop aromas of earthy or floral. And very low levels of diacetyl are acceptable. We've talked about this in quite a few of our English beer styles, that English yeast is not great at, or it actually is great at flocculating. And when it does that, it pulls the yeast out of suspension a little bit faster. So you may have some diacetyl left in many English beer styles as a result of that. So again, if you're drinking a dark mild and you're wondering if the diacetyl you're tasting is very low or if it's too high for the style, it's probably too high for the style. The appearance is going to be copper to dark brown or mahogany. It's generally going to be clear, although traditionally it's unfiltered. The head retention may be poor, and the head color is going to be off-white to tan. So the flavor with the dark mild is, for the malt, we would expect a wide range of malt-based flavors, such as caramel, toasty, grainy, toffee, nutty, chocolate, or lightly roasted. Again, it may have some fruitiness. And the hop bitterness, again, so this is called a dark mild. So it's going to be mild in a lot of aspects, most of all in that hop character. So our hop bitterness is going to be low to moderate. The hop flavor will be none to low. If it's present, it's going to be earthy or floral. With the fermentation characteristics, it might not have any fermentation characteristics, but it can have up to moderate esters, which are typically going to be fruity, licorice, plum, or raisin. And again, it can also have low levels of diacetyl. And then the finish and aftertaste is going to be sweet to dry. Our mouthfeel is going to be light to medium, and carbonation is going to be low to medium low. Next, we have British Brown Ale. This is a malty, brown, caramel-centric British ale without the roasted flavors of a porter. And that roast character is an important distinction, particularly if you're doing something like a BJCP tasting exam, like a Cicerone exam, and you have this beer in front of you and you're being asked, is this a British Brown Ale? Is this an English porter? If you get any kind of hint of roast, then it's not going to be a British Brown Ale, or it won't be a proper British Brown Ale. So just keep that in mind, that with a British Brown Ale, it's really going to be more caramel centric, but if you get any hint of roast, that's going to be inappropriate. So for aroma, for the malt, we would expect light toffee, nutty, or light chocolate, and then a light to heavy caramel quality. Hops may be light, they don't have to be there, but if they're there, they should be an appealing floral or earthy. Esters, we may have a light fruitiness, we may not. So again, if you have a British Brown Ale and you don't get a light fruitiness, that isn't necessarily a fault. You can have up to a light fruitiness. For appearance, it's going to be dark amber to dark reddish brown and clear. Our head color is going to be low to moderate, off-white to tan. So for the flavor, this again is going to be a very malt-focused beer, gentle to moderate sweetness, light to heavy caramel character, and it may have nutty, toasted, biscuity, toffee, or light chocolate character. But really that caramel character is going to be what dominates the palate, even if these other flavors are there. Hop bitterness is going to be medium, low to medium, and flavor, you may not have any hop flavor. If it's there, it's going to be up to a low level of floral or earthy. For the fermentation characteristics, low to moderate fruity esters, and our aftertaste is going to be medium to dry. Mouthfeel will be medium light to medium, and carbonation will be medium to medium high. So the last beer in this group we'll talk about is English Porter. This is a moderate strength brown beer with a restrained roasty character and bitterness. So our aroma for an English porter, starting with the malt, is going to be moderately low to moderate, bready, biscuity, and toasty with mild roastiness. It may have a chocolate quality, and it may also show some caramel, nutty, or toffee supporting notes. For the hops, we may have up to a moderate level of floral or earthy. And for esters, none to moderate fruity esters. And again, as with most of our English beer styles, a low level of diacetyl is acceptable. It's optional, meaning that it does not have to be there. You don't need to go looking for diacetyl in an English porter. It's going to be light to dark brown in color. The clarity is going to be good, although with most dark beers, as it's approaching that darker end, it may be approaching being opaque. Your head retention is going to be fair to good, and your head color is going to be moderate off-white to light tan. With the flavor, you would expect a moderate bready, biscuity, or toasty flavor, mild to moderate roastiness, often with a chocolate character, also often with a significant caramel, nutty, or toffee character. It may have other secondary flavors such as coffee, licorice, or toast, but it should not have a significant burnt or harsh character. Hop bitterness will be medium low to medium, and hop flavor will be none to moderate floral or earthy. Fermentation characteristics, we might not have any diacetyl. If it's there, it shouldn't go above that moderately low level. And we may also have low to moderate fruity esters. The balance can range from slightly malty to slightly bitter. Our body is going to be medium light to medium, carbonation moderately low to moderately high, creaminess light to moderate. So next we'll move into the Scottish ale category. And Scottish ales, you'll see as we talk through them, they're really all extremely similar. And so we'll be able to move through them fairly quickly because they really do all have the exact same descriptions. Sometimes you may hear Scottish ale referred to as a shilling ale, or have that shilling description of the backslash with the dash. That is, when we're talking about Scottish ales, that's not technically correct, but it's widely used. And the shillings were referring to the cost of a barrel of beer and not to particular styles. So it's kind of like when we were talking about stouts, and the stout particularly used to refer to the strength of a beer rather than a style of beer. That's how shilling was also. Know when you see a Scottish ale that's marked as a 60 shilling or a 90 shilling, you can generally understand where those are going to fit within these substyles that we'll be talking about, but it's not technically correct. But again, there's no beer style police to show up and find somebody for calling a Scottish ale a shilling ale. So with our Scottish ales, these are going to be dark malt focused with nearly the same guidelines for all three styles. So as the gravity increases, so does the character of the beer in question. And Scotch ale, also known as wee heavy, is not included in this category. We talked about Scotch ale in week 8, I believe, and it's not included in this category. You'll see these descriptions are all extremely similar, and with the 2015 guidelines, the BJCP slotted the Scotch ale into the heavy or the strong British beer category. So historically, all three types were party guiled, and we won't go too deep into the technical aspects of brewing throughout these courses, but a party guile generally is where you have during your mash, as you're lautering, as you're rinsing those sugars away from that spent grain. When you're doing a party guile, you will lauter for the first time. That will give you your strongest beer. Will have the highest gravity because it's going to have the most amount of sugars. So in this case, that would be our Scottish export. Then you would lauter it again. And so you're running water through those same spent grains and rinsing off a little bit more sugar, but not quite as much sugar as the last time. And then, so for purposes of our discussion here, that would be the Scottish heavy. And then you would run water through it one more time, and that would give you the weakest gravity beer because it would have the lower amount of sugars in it, and that would be the Scottish light. You can party guile once or twice. It doesn't necessarily have to be 3 times, but historically, these were all made from the same mash that has just been lautered 3 times. So each time you're getting a lower degree of gravity. And the Scottish ale, and we'll talk about this also with the Irish red ale in a few minutes, but this represents an adaptation of English bitters, but with lower ABV and lower hopping rates, as well as being darker in color. So our Scottish ales, these will, as we're talking through them, they will sound a lot like the ordinary bitter, best bitter, and strong bitter we talked about a few weeks ago. That's because it's an adaptation of English bitters. So starting with Scottish Light, a malt-focused, generally caramelly beer with perhaps a few esters and occasionally a butterscotch aftertaste. So you'll see with Scottish Light, our ABV range is going to be 2.5 to 3.2%. So it's going to be very, very low ABV. For aroma, it's going to be low to medium. It will often have malt aromas of toasted breadcrumbs, ladyfingers, and English biscuits. Low to medium caramel is allowable, and low butterscotch is allowable. Our hops are going to be low earthy, floral, orange citrus, spicy, traditional English hop aroma. And esters, the best examples will have a light palm fruitiness. So that's going to be something like a pear, any kind of a palm fruit. Appearance, pale copper to very dark brown. It should be clear. Our head color is going to be low to moderate off-white, and the texture is going to be creamy. So with the flavor, it's going to be entirely malt focused, and it's going to range from pale, bready malt flavors with caramel overtones to rich, toasty malt with roasted accents, or anywhere in between. The bitterness is going to be enough to balance the malt. And one hallmark of Scottish beers is having a very low hop character if it's there at all. So if you do have hop flavor, it will be low, be earthy, floral, orange citrus, spicy, traditional English hop flavors. Fruity esters are not required, but add depth, yet are never high. So you can have just a very malt-focused beer with a very clean fermentation profile, but it will add some complexity. Thinking back, like this is such a light ABV beer that any kind of additional flavor from the brewing process is going to add depth and interest to the beer. The finish ranges from rich and malty to dry and grainy. Subtle butterscotch character is acceptable, but burnt sugar is not. Our mouthfeel is going to be medium low to medium, and our carbonation is going to be low to medium. So talking through the next two, Scottish Heavy and Scottish Export, I won't spend a ton of time on the descriptions because they are exactly the same as the Scottish Light. You can even see the overall impression is a malt-focused, generally caramelly beer with perhaps a few esters and occasionally a butterscotch aftertaste. And looking, when you read through the BJCP guidelines, I promise I'm not just being lazy in the descriptions that I'm writing, they really are all identical. So what we'll point out with the Scottish Heavy is that ABV range is now 3.2 to 3.9%. So you can see we have the exact same descriptions for what to expect in the aroma and the appearance, as well as the flavor and the mouthfeel. So I really won't spend any time, rehashing those. Just understand that as we're talking about the Scottish Heavy, as opposed to the Scottish Light, we're getting more of all of these characters. Still, it's a low ABV beer, so you're not getting it's not drinking a Scottish Light compared to drinking a wee heavy. It's going to be incrementally, everything will be intensified just a little bit more. And with Scottish Export, this is going to be the exact same, a malt-focused, generally caramelly beer with perhaps a few esters and occasionally a butterscotch aftertaste. So pointing out here, the ABV range is 3.9 to 6.0%. And as you're looking through the Scottish ales, compare those to the English bitters, and you will see that even the ABV ranges match up almost exactly between these two styles of beer. So we have our exact same description as we did for Scottish Heavy and Scottish Light. Again, with the party guile system, the Scottish Export represents the beer that's going to have the most amount of the flavors, of the aromas, of the ABV. And so think about it as like a ladder, right? So as we're going up from Scottish Light to Scottish Heavy to Scottish Export, the ABV is increasing. The flavors are generally going to remain the same. They're going to just be amplified in an incremental way. And the flavor is going to be the same. Our mouthfeel will have a little bit more body, and then our carbonation is going to be low to medium. So that's going to be the Scottish ales. Again, if you have any questions going through those, definitely bring those to our review session in a few weeks. I promise I was not trying to shortchange you all by not reading through each one, but it would be very repetitive if I did so. So now we're going to finish up with Irish beers. These are traditional Irish beers, amber to dark in color. They're going to be top fermented, moderate to slightly strong in strength. So our Irish red ale is an easy drinking pint, often with subtle flavors. And it's funny to me when I read through the Irish red ale style because it a very simple style. It's one that I always think of as like a classic kind of 1990s brew pub style that it's not terribly complex. It's very much the Irish answer to something like a bitter or something like a Scottish ale, even something like an American lager. So it's going to be a light ABV that's designed to appeal to as many people as possible flavor-wise. So the malt is going to be low to moderate, either grainy neutral or with a lightly caramel toasty coffee character. You will usually not have any hop aroma present, but if it's there, it should be low, earthy, or floral. There may be a very light buttery character to it, but it's not required. And overall is going to be quite clean. So actually in the United States, most of us are maybe familiar with Killian's, which is a Coors product. Killian's is actually a lager. And I'm not exactly sure when they did the BJCP guidelines, why they made the decision to make this an Irish red ale as opposed to an Irish red beer, to make it allowable to have a lager fermentation. But it's regardless, is going to be quite clean. And if you can, I think a really great, if you can find them, a really great side-by-side to help train yourself on the difference between a lager fermentation and an ale fermentation would be to get an Irish red ale, something like a Smithwick's, which is the most popular Irish red ale, and a Killian's, and taste those two side by side, because Smithwick's obviously is going to be an ale, Killian's is going to be a lager, but they're going to have similar styles, similar flavor profiles. So that would be a really great way to learn to help train your palate on the differences that ale and lager fermentation can bring. So our color is going to be medium amber to medium amber copper, quite clear. Average head retention is going to be low. Our head color will be low off-white to tan. The flavor for the malt, moderate to very little caramel and sweetness, rarely with a lightly buttered toast or toffee-like note, often fairly grainy and neutral, or can have a lightly toasty or biscuity note. Our bitterness is going to be medium low to medium, and the flavor is going to be optional. So if it's there, you should expect light, earthy, or floral flavors. None to low esters. The balance tends to be slightly towards the malt, and the aftertaste is medium dry to dry. The mouthfeel will be medium light to medium, moderate carbonation, and is going to be a smooth beer. And I know there are some judges out there who pull their hair out at people describing beers as smooth, because it's a little ambiguous, but keeping in mind the kind of the whole point of an Irish red ale is for companies like Guinness to be able to compete in that like light colored, easy drinking, moderate ABV beer arena. And so the next, speaking of Guinness, we will talk about Irish Stout. This is a black beer with a pronounced roasted flavor, often similar to coffee. And what I like to talk about with Irish Stout is you can see our ABV is 4.0 to 4.5%. It's a very light ABV beer. And I think Irish Stout is a great example of the color of a beer doesn't dictate what the ABV will be. And, we as humans are predisposed to, when we see a darker beer, we assume it has more ABV, or it's going to be like a full bodied beer. And that is not the case at all with Irish Stout. And I remember when I used to drink Guinness a lot more often than I do now, and people would say, "Oh, I don't know how you drink that. It tastes like motor oil." And that's really not that's not at all the case with something like a Guinness with an Irish Stout. It's very light bodied, very low ABV. So for our aroma, the malt is going to have a moderate coffee-like aroma that typically dominates. It may have a slight dark chocolate, cocoa, and or roasted grain notes. Hops will be none to low. If there are hops there, they may be lightly earthy, floral, too earthy, but it's typically absent. Esters, none to medium low. It's going to be jet black to very deep brown with ruby highlights in color, although Guinness says that their Guinness draft is actually a very dark red. It's going to be opaque. It's going to have a long-lasting tan to brown, thick, and creamy head. So for our flavor, moderate roasted grain or malt. It may also have a bittersweet or unsweetened chocolate character. And one thing to note about Irish stouts, this will get a little granular, that you won't need to know this for your BJCP beer judging exam or for your Cicerone exam, for your levels 1 and 2 Cicerone exam. But when we're talking about Irish stouts, there's really, you can break them down into even further into two sub styles. So you have the Dublin style stout and the Cork style stout. The Dublin style stout, think about Guinness, right? So Guinness uses roasted barley in its recipe, and that's what gives Guinness that characteristic dry, like roasted malt flavor, or pardon me, roasted grain flavor, because it hasn't been malted. Whereas the Cork style stout does not use roasted barley, so it's going to be a little bit sweeter. So another side-by-side homework for you to do is to grab a bottle of Guinness Draft and taste it side by side with a Murphy's, because Guinness is, of course, our Dublin style stout and Murphy's is a Cork style stout. So you can taste the difference between those two. Again, that's not something that you would be tested on, but it is good to do a side by side with them to really learn the range of what an Irish stout can be. So our bitterness is going to be medium to high. The flavor is going to be none to medium earthy. For fermentation characteristics, there may not be any, but they can be up to medium low level of fruitiness. The aftertaste can be dry and coffee-like to moderately balanced with a touch of caramel. And that may sound familiar, what we just talked about. Dry and coffee-like is going to typically be more of a Dublin style stout, whereas the moderately balanced with a touch of caramel is going to be more of a Cork style stout. Medium light to medium full body, low to moderate carbonation. It may have some creaminess, particularly when it's served on nitro. And you may have a little bit of astringency from the roasted grains. And on the nitro note, when you're judging a beer, an Irish stout, don't judge it as if it were poured on nitro, right? We're judging it as if it has just our normal CO2 forced carbonation in it, because particularly for homebrewers, you're not going to have an Irish stout with that, with the widget, like the similar to what comes in a Guinness Draft can. So don't expect to be receiving a lot of Irish stouts that are nitrogenated. But if you're out somewhere and they have Irish stout on a nitro tap, then you will expect a little bit more of the creaminess from that nitrogenation. So then the last beer we'll talk about is Irish Extra Stout. And at this point, we've gone through the rest of our stout families for our week 10 slides. And Irish Extra Stout is really going to be, well, it's an Irish stout, but just a little bit extra. So it's getting closer to some of the stouts we spoke about in week 10, like a foreign extra stout. So an Irish Extra Stout is a fuller bodied black beer with a pronounced roast flavor, often similar to coffee and dark chocolate with some malty complexity. So again, our ABV range, 5.5 to 6.5%. This is a moderate strength beer, even though it's going to be very dark in color. So another reminder not to judge a malt's strength or a beer's strength by its color. So our aroma is going to be moderate to moderately high coffee, often with slight dark chocolate, cocoa, biscuit, vanilla, and or roasted grain secondary notes. The hops, if they're there, are going to be low to spicy, but they're typically absent. This is a malt forward beer. Esters none to medium low. The appearance will be jet black. It's going to be opaque with a tan, thick, and creamy head. And again, recall that head color is going to be tan because of the use of the roasted malts. For our flavor, moderate to moderately high dark roasted grain or malt, typically has roasted coffee-like flavors, often has a dark chocolate character, and you may have background flavors of mocha, biscuit, or vanilla. Those are often present, but again, they don't have to be there. Bitterness is medium to medium high. Flavor is hop flavors, none to medium earthy or spicy. So our finish and aftertaste can be dry and coffee-like to moderately balanced with up to moderate caramel or malt sweetness. Our body is going to be medium full to full. Our carbonation is going to be moderate. Because we're starting to get up slightly in ABV, there may be a slight amount of warmth that is allowable. You may also have a light astringency from the roasted grains, and our other palate sensations is going to be very smooth. So that wraps up our week 9 review of brown British beer, Scottish ale, and Irish beer. Please bring any questions you have about these styles. You may either email me directly, or as I mentioned, we have our last review session in a few weeks. Feel free to submit those questions for that review session. Any questions you have about these styles there as well. And with that, I will end this, and thank you everyone for watching this. Thank you for attending the beer judge training. Thank you for being understanding when I needed to reschedule this training, and we will see you next time.